Welcome to the monthly Truck Stop webinars presented by the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation. The Truck Stop's presented the second Thursday of each month at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. These webinars are open to members of the MCIEF Foundation. These webinars presented as industry updates for information purposes only and do not qualify for state CE credits. If you're seeking state CE credit, please visit our website and we'll give you the 12 hours that we provide on an annual basis, plus the other face-to-face opportunities to gain your CE through the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat window. They will be answered as time allows or responded to after the webinar via email. If you experience audio problems, please send us a note in the chat window or call 800-741-484. We'll attempt to correct the problems as soon as possible. Scott Cornell, Travelers' second vice president, is an expert in cargo, at least someone that I would rely on in cargo. I reached out to him and asked him if he would spend some time with us talking about or updating us on the cargo theft trends as I've been reading in the papers. And I thought this would be a timely right now, since our insureds are having various hauling opportunities tonight. Scott, welcome. Appreciate you getting up and being with us today.
Hey.
Anything you want to say about yourselves other than that little introduction about your relationship with Travelers?
No, just I appreciate you making time for us. I lead transportation here at Travelers, and prior to leading Travelers, I did cargo theft investigations and prevention for 20-some years, 25, 26 years, something like that altogether. I can never remember how long. It feels like it's been forever.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I've been doing this forever. That's my comment. When dirt was before dirt was provided. Right. Anyway, anyway, we appreciate you doing this, and you got a lot of good information here as a review. You and I can have some dialogue to this, but go ahead and kick it off, and it's up to you. Take it away, Scott.
All right. So this is our disclaimer. We have to do this as part of our presentations. Obviously, one of the main points we're trying to make here is that the information is proprietary and not for general distribution. Obviously, Tommy, you'll be using it for MCIEF, and then also that there's no silver bullet. I can't provide a way or methods that will 100% prevent cargo theft. It's a changing thing. It changes on a regular basis. We always kind of joke about it that a lot of things change every year in cargo theft, and a lot of things stay the same, and you just can't predict which one's going to be which.
But it's a good point to still remember, because theft is the second largest. I don't know if it's dollar-wise, but obviously the second most frequent cause of a loss, being crash being number one. But of course, in cargo theft, there's not as much question about salvage and all those other things that come up on a crash situation. So it is a high dollar exposure, and typically a total loss instead of some partial losses.
You're exactly right. Theft tends to be the number 2 cause of loss in motor truck cargo, and certain times of the year and certain parts of the country, it can even be first. So if you're thinking about, pre-Christmas time, somewhere between September and December in, let's say, Southern California, theft could be tied for number 1 or even take the lead for a short period of time. So it's right up there, and it's significant.
All right, the change the face of cargo theft. I like that changing face, because as you said, it depends on what's hot right now. I assume that maybe right now toilet paper might be hot. Where
home goods, right? Home goods.
Yeah, where some other things might not have, given the time of what's going on. So go ahead.
Yeah. So why cargo theft? Why does somebody commit cargo theft? Well, what we know over the years is that there's very little risk, but it's high profit, right? So traditionally, over the years, cargo thieves will sometimes commit cargo theft multiple times, often not get caught. When they do get caught, punishment can be low. It depends on the state and the area of the country that you're in. Some states have specific laws around cargo theft. Most do not. It's also a crime of opportunity. You know, when Tommy, you and I were talking earlier, it's, you know, the old adage is freight at rest is freight at risk. You know, we talk about the fact that in the United States, cargo theft is largely nonviolent. There's very little violence associated with cargo theft. And one of the reasons for that is obviously because it would increase the sentencing if you were caught doing it and committing violence. But the other part of it is because it's sitting everywhere and it's easy to steal, right? So
Yes.
there's not a lot. Go ahead.
Scott, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but
No,
another thing here, and this might be more of a rumor than it is or than it is fact, but a lot of cargo thefts I hear have maybe a driver involved in it, where not actually there, but I had one where they were hauling some furniture out of the port of Miami over to Naples. I already mentioned two bad areas there coming across that. And after he picked up the load, he stopped at the rest station and for an hour and a half for lunch, where the whole trip only took 2 hours. Guess what happened when he came back after lunch?
Sure.
That wasn't there. Now, whether and never proved that he was involved in it or not, but those kind of things always raise their head when these things happen, where it is at a convenient location, and as you say, was at rest. Is their involvement in the driver part of it?
So that's so it's a common question that I get, and I would tell you, as somebody who's been around it and done it for a long time, like we said earlier, it's largely overstated. So what I'm not saying that there's not driver involvement sometimes. We do see driver involvement sometimes, but it's, in my experience over the years, it's been largely overstated. Most of the time, or sometimes you get people looking into the cargo theft or investigating the cargo theft that don't have experience with cargo theft, and they have a tough time sometimes getting past the driver, because drivers do things that drivers do, right? So, in other words, leaving the tractor running with the keys in it. That will stump a lot of people who are not around the trucking industry. But you and I both know drivers leave the tractors running with the keys in it, right? I mean, it's a normal thing. So if you know it, you understand the industry, then that doesn't really puzzle you too much, right? But somebody who hasn't, or the question will come, why would they park that there, in that place? Well, they've been parking it there for 10 years and never had a problem. And so I think sometimes there's a little too much put on that. We do see it happen sometimes, but not as often as some.
And also might be the type of operations where if there's normal fleet, where the fleet owner vents the drivers and who they hire in that versus, and has a contract with a shipper versus somebody who's hauling from off the spot market with one or two trucks, also might have a little more vulnerability in those areas too. But anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I agree with you. I think it's overstated, and I don't think the drivers are as involved as people think they are. But I think, as you just pointed out, it's a myth there that, and I didn't want to interrupt beyond that. But when you talk about at rest, that reminded me to ask you that question. Go ahead.
Yep. And I think, from my experience over the years, drivers are as shocked as anybody when they become a victim of cargo theft, and they're usually frustrated and upset about it. And they're very hardworking people, and they get as surprised as anybody else. When you talk about law enforcement, we know that there is law enforcement dedicated across the country, but the numbers on that are very low. Over the years, we've seen that change to, at high points, we've seen almost 100 dedicated law enforcement working on cargo theft across the country in various task forces, to a time now where there might be 50 or 60 dedicated law enforcement. Now, when you take them, they're very good at it. First of all, when they're dedicated to it and they specialize in it, they're very good at it. They're usually spread out in task forces, which is a good thing when you're working with them to try and recover cargo or solve cargo theft, but that really concentrates them into certain areas. So California has a few cargo theft task forces or units. Tennessee, Memphis, the Memphis Task Force, Miami-Dade, the Florida statewide, the GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation. New Jersey has a unit. Illinois has one officer now. They used to have multiple. They have one officer now. So it's very concentrated in certain parts of the country and not spread out across the rest of the country. So across the rest of the country, you don't really have a lot of dedicated law enforcement. And sometimes you're working with police officers that have never done cargo theft before or never seen it before. They're usually very enthusiastic and willing to work with you, but you don't see the numbers dedicated like you do to something like auto theft or narcotics or something like that.
We actually had someone from the Miami task force a couple of years ago that presented at the annual conference.
Yep, Carlos Rosario, I believe it was.
With Carlos, right? Yes.
Yep. We mentioned earlier a few states with enhanced sentencing. Who's the victim? A lot of people have a hard time understanding who the victim is. Is it the trucking company? Is it the freight broker? Is it the insurance carrier? Who's the victim in that? And because of that, we get very few citizens complaints, right? So you don't see a lot of citizens calling their local PD complaining about cargo theft. Most don't really know that it's going on until it's brought up through, a news clip or a story or something that they hear about. The average person isn't aware that a lot of this goes on. So it's an easy area. So that's why cargo theft, it's an easy area for people to go in, get a big hit, make some profit. We know the supply chain is complex, and we know that there's a lot of moving parts to it. And people will often think, well, the opportunity for theft happens once it's on the road. That's really not the case. The opportunity for theft, and we're going to talk about the different types of theft as we get into this, can be at almost any point of the process. It can happen during the marketing. It can happen during the point of sale. It can happen during the planning, the dispatching, the point of pickup, the transport, the warehousing, the delivery. It can happen in all those things because it can happen in different ways. And sometimes it's just taking advantage of what's going on or miscommunication. So one of the things I always point out as an example is, let's take marketing, for example. The sales team is out there trying to sell capacity. They're trying to book loads, or book clients to get loads for their company. And somebody in marketing or sales may say or agree to haul a certain type of cargo, high value. It could be high value, high theft target cargo, things like that. And if they don't communicate that with the security team or the risk control team, it can be a surprise. So all of a sudden, one day or a week out, hey, we have these loads. We're going to be hauling pharma, for example, or we're going to be hauling, high value electronics. Well, that needs to be communicated immediately at the point of marketing, not last minute or right before those loads or those lanes are going to open up for that company, so that the risk control department or the risk manager or the security manager, depending on how your company is set up, can plan the load security around those lanes so that you don't have any incidents. So sometimes it can just be communication that creates the opening, but we're going to talk more about that as we go forward. So here are the hot spots, right? This map provided to us by CargoNet, and I'll talk a little bit about CargoNet as well as some other resources that are out there. But when you look at the map, you can see there's a couple of things that these areas have in common. One, they're either near ports or close to ports, or they're along main arterial highways, right? So when you look at Florida, obviously large port, Southern California, large port, Washington, large port, Texas, you have Dallas and Houston, the port of Houston there. Chicago area is considered an inland port because of the rail lines. You have New York, New Jersey. Those areas there all have either ports or inland ports, heavy rail, heavy arterial highways. You also have big economies, right? Dense population. So it makes sense that this is where cargo theft happens and where the cargo thieves are often spending a lot of their time. Now, I'm going to make a bigger statement that goes beyond this map. And I have a friend who always says, if you work in the blue area and you move goods in the blue area and you think you just don't have any theft, you're wrong. And the reason he says that is because what we all know is that cargo theft is not accurately tracked by the federal government right now. And so the numbers around cargo theft, like the numbers that we're going to review, are largely provided by two main companies, CargoNet and SensiGuard. And these two companies, they collect voluntarily reported cargo thefts, and they aggregate that data, and they both do a very good job of taking that data and sending it out to the industry and providing us with trends. The issue with using data that's voluntarily collected is that there's some volatility to it. Again, these companies do a good job using the data that they get, but if people decide they don't want to report, then you could have somebody assume that cargo theft is down. If people start reporting that haven't been reporting before, you could make an assumption that cargo theft is up, when in reality, it could very well be that the reporting is down or the reporting is up. And so you have to get a good feel for what's going on a street level. We do that. We have that because at Travelers, we have an investigative unit, our special investigations group, that are 10 investigators that are dedicated to cargo theft and work on behalf of our clients to recover cargo and solve cargo thefts and prevent cargo theft. So what they do is, by being on the street level for us, we're always up to date on what's actually happening out there, and we can take that and we can compare it and contrast it to what comes out in the numbers. And we encourage people to have some sort of that contact. If they don't have that type of a resource for themselves, either in-house, make some connections, get connected with the task forces, get connected with the dedicated cargo theft units across the country, so you can look at the numbers and you can also get some firsthand knowledge of what they're actually seeing, and you can compare and contrast the two things. So if we take this map, we keep that in mind and we move forward, we look at cargo theft over the years by quarter, and we see that it's very up and down. And so this kind of goes back to what I was just talking about with the voluntarily reported numbers. Is the cargo theft down here in the second quarter of 2017, or was reporting down? When we move forward to late 2014, this is the fourth quarter, we traditionally see a fourth quarter bump in cargo theft because of all the freight that's on the move for Christmas time, holiday time, but we also could be seeing an increase in reporting. So we have to try and figure out, from what we get from our team or what you might get from having contact with somebody out on the street, what is actually going on. Is there more theft, or is it being reported better? We saw big dips here in early 2019. We saw some dips in 2018, and we did know and we did verify that some of that was based on lower reporting. But we also know that some of it was down because of various arrests that law enforcement made and organized cargo theft groups that were broken up as a result of that. So it's just good to make sure you get some resources that you can use to compare and contrast. When we go forward and we look at the states, I would tell you that most of these states are almost always the same. California is always number one. I've been doing cargo theft for a long time, and I've never seen California fall out of the number one spot. I will give you an example, though, of the volatility around the voluntary reporting, right? I can't remember the year it was. It might have been 2013, 2014. At one point at the end of the year, or one of those years, California came in as being in second or third place, depending on the report that you read. And myself and several other experts in the field were a little puzzled by that. We got together, we got on a phone call, we're starting to discuss it. And what we found out was that the analyst in California that usually reports the numbers had left the position, left the job right before the fourth quarter. So the fourth quarter numbers weren't reported. So, and when they replaced that position, those numbers were retroactively put back in, and California went into the number one spot. So that's a good example of the volatility you have. California is always number one. These other states will change the order. Sometimes Texas is in number two, sometimes it's in third, sometimes Florida's number two. Georgia used to be right up there as number two, sometimes number three, but the GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigations Cargo Theft Unit, has done a fantastic job over the past years really reducing cargo theft in that state. So they've pushed out, and sometimes they're lower, sometimes they're higher. But Illinois, Ontario, Canada, which is included in the CargoNet reports, we know there's some real good activity up there for cargo theft, especially around that Toronto and Montreal area. And these other ones here, Pennsylvania will jump in and out of this list, and Alabama is actually new to the list over the last couple of years with an increase in the number of thefts that have been seen. And a lot of times that's cargo that's coming out of Georgia, going into Alabama. Some of it we know is actually starting in Alabama and stolen shortly after it takes off. These are some of the busiest counties across the state. Again, a great job by these companies like CargoNet that break down this data that they get, even if it is what we consider a sampling of what's going on, because we know not all cargo theft is reported, right? They take it, they slice it and dice it, they give you some very relevant information. So again, California being number one, you can now see exactly where in California, what county it has the most concentration of it. In LA, they have 2 counties in this list. Cook County, obviously around Chicago, Dallas, and Miami-Dade. This is a statistic that I think is very important for our audience, Tommy, is the delay in reporting, right? So when you look at this, and this is a statistic that CargoNet started putting together just a couple of years ago, or just recently, that I think is very useful, especially during instruction, which is the delay in reporting, right? So after the first 24 to 48 hours, recovery of a stolen load is reduced, probably by at least half, by 50%, right? And you see that there's been some improvement. With, myself and several others are out there constantly preaching in the industry, hey, you got to report early, you got to report right away. But even if you're reporting 1 to 3 days out, you're still way behind in trying to recover cargo. And you see the low numbers for reporting on the same day. Now, obviously, preaching across the industry, this number seems to be going up. That's a good trend for us to see, but still very low. So in essence, less than a quarter of all cargo theft is reported the same day that it happens. And when you get out to these bigger numbers that are 7 days out, that's a big problem. You're going to have a really hard time trying to recover any of the stolen load when you're waiting 7 or more days to report those thefts. So
this shows CargoNet's information. Does your travelers data track this too? Because I totally agree with you, and we preach often. In fact, I did it on the Road Dog radio show a couple of days ago. You got to report all the claims. You got to report them immediately, whether they're liability or physical damage or cargo, so that the mechanisms in place. You all trying to recover it from the traveler's cargo standpoint, or having a lawyer document or a lost person document what happened at the crash. All that's very important. But your statistics track this pretty close.
We don't in general look at the numbers for that. We do we spend a lot of time encouraging our insureds to report very quickly. We make them aware of the fact that we have the resources for them, that we have that cargo theft investigation team, right? So that if they report it to us very quickly, we're going to assign one of those investigators to it very quickly, and we're going to have a better chance at helping them recover it. So we do a lot of communication with our clients around that. And, we take a look at this stat right here, and we, when we get an opportunity like this, as we are here this morning with you, we really take the time to talk about the importance of this.
So that would be something for who's listening to us, who are retail agents, you need to express to your insureds that this is just as important as reporting a crash or something like that, or any kind of other instance is the cargo theft. Don't try to go find it yourself. Let's get on top of it as soon as possible.
Exactly. And even if you don't have a resource like we do, right, if the theft happens in one of those hotspots that we showed on the map, remember what we also said is in those hotspots, which are those dedicated law enforcement groups, right? So if you call that in, a lot of those groups are on call 24/7. We didn't mention Kentucky, but Kentucky has a couple of officers that are also dedicated that are on call 24/7. And we know a lot of these guys, and they pick up the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning. So this is the important part of networking. And then if you do have a theft and it's 2 o'clock in the morning on a Friday, I think quite often there's a thought that there's really nobody to call. But depending on where you are, and really doesn't matter where you are, there's always law enforcement on duty, right? And even if they're not dedicated to cargo theft, if it just happened and you're calling them timely, they're going to jump on it, right? And you're going to have a better chance at getting a recovery. So timely reporting is critical. When we look at the commodities, and Tommy, you and I have talked about this a couple times recently, right? In 2010,
I wanted to share something. And you remember this many years ago, where I asked people, and I don't give a date anymore, that most stolen items at one point in time were diapers, just the consumer goods, the things that are easy to sell in the market, those kind of things. People don't look at that once you steal it, you got to get rid of it. And some of the stuff that we're looking at here can easily be rid of at flea markets or non-franchise convenience stores or eBay or online and things like that. In fact, just Selective Insurance Company, who you surely know who they are, and we do their CE for them, shared a loss with us where they tracked the stolen load of golf balls and found that it was sold on eBay 2 weeks before it was stolen.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, so then they're out shopping for exactly what they want to steal, right? So
right. So this is my point here. Everything could be subject to theft. That's the point.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we know that in 2010, food and beverage took over the #1 spot. Now, I have a friend, Keith Lewis, who's with CargoNet, who's been doing cargo theft even longer than me, or been around the trucking industry longer than me, and he talks about, and I'm not trying to give away Keith's age, but he talks about how way back in the day, I think Gerald Ford's team put together a study on cargo theft way back then, and it was food and beverage was the #1 stolen commodity way back then. Now, somewhere over time that changed, and electronics was in large part the #1 stolen commodity, most frequent stolen and targeted commodity. And then in 2010, we saw food and beverage come back into the #1 spot. And we know that happened initially for economic reasons. This was right as the economy had a downturn and people go back to basics, right? And one thing that cargo thieves are really good at is stealing what they know they can sell. And they knew at the time there wasn't a lot of extra money out there for luxuries like electronics, things like that, but that people were concentrating on things like feeding themselves, housing themselves, clothing themselves. So they went out and they started targeting food and beverage more frequently than they did electronics. It's stayed in that #1 spot ever since, because we know that they learned that this is a very good commodity to steal. Why? Why is food and beverage one of the better commodities to steal? Well, first of all, the evidence disappears because it's consumed. So very shortly after the theft occurs, the evidence disappears. And now, if you're a law enforcement or you're a cargo theft investigator, you're not really out there with the ability to recover anything or gather any evidence based on the product, because it's gone. Two, and Tommy, you had mentioned this prior to us even starting the presentation, the values were a lot lower. And so we had an industry that was in some cases concentrating on HVL, which is called high value load. It's an acronym for high value load, and people would put security procedures and process in place around their HVL loads. So you had the higher value loads, the electronics, the perfumes, the clothing, things like that, that had a more stringent security process or procedure around them because of their value. But then you had the food and beverage category, which, you know, the average value of a load can range anywhere, depending on the commodity, you know, if it's produce or you get up to frozen meats, can range anywhere from $25,000 to $180,000 if it's frozen meat or something like that. But the average is around $75,000. So some companies will actually set a dollar threshold on what they consider a high value load. 75,000 is almost never going to hit that threshold. So if it doesn't hit that threshold, you have a commodity that people need and want every day, you have a commodity where the product disappears shortly after it's stolen, and you have a commodity that has very low security protocols around it because it is not considered a high value load. So it's kind of the perfect storm for the bad guys. There's almost no way to track. We always joke about the fact that, frozen chicken doesn't have a serial number on it. You're not connecting frozen chicken to the internet like you are electronics. That's the other thing around the electronics category that people don't think about is almost everything we buy nowadays that's an electronics device will connect to the internet. And if it will connect to the internet, a lot of times it can be located.
It's traceable, right? No serial number, but traceable.
Right. So you see a lot of times the thieves, I think have become aware of that, and they know how easy it is for the food and beverage category. They still target electronics, especially around that Christmas time. We see, a heightened effort around the electronics category, and then household goods, right? So, you kind of mentioned it earlier, diapers, but you think about hand soap or shampoo or bathroom towels, those general household goods, those have become a very popular theft commodity too. Again, very easy to steal, very easy to move. So good product for the thieves. Pharmaceutical, you still see on this list, you see the numbers have gone down over the years, but I would say over the longer period of time, over the past 10 to 15 years, you've really seen pharmaceuticals and the number of thefts around pharmaceuticals go down, in large part because of the heightened ability of the pharmaceutical industry. They've put a lot more security protocols around it. They were hit pretty frequently and pretty hard by cargo theft a long time ago. They really got together and worked on the protocols and the security around those loads, so you don't see a lot of pharmaceutical loads taken. And when you do, a lot of times it's part of the last mile courier process of pharmaceuticals. So not the big full truckloads, but quite often it's the last mile courier loads that are being hit that are on their way to the local pharmacy or the store or things like that.
I'd imagine it'd be hard to get rid of some of that pharmaceutical stuff that requires, that would have to at least get rid of it domestically, because a lot of people are very aware now of what they put in their bodies and things like that.
You would hope, but a lot of that stuff, if they need to, they'll ship it out of the country. There's a lot of danger behind there. Chuck Forsyth, who heads up the PCSC, Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Security Council, really gets into great detail when he does presentations on this and talks about how, and makes the point that, cargo thieves, they don't care about anybody, really. So they're not refrigerating the insulin when they steal it. They're not refrigerating the pharmaceuticals when they steal it, things like that. So it can be a very dangerous commodity once it's stolen. So we need to be careful on that.
I agree with that.
So this is just showing again, that both. So this one is a SensiGuard and Sensitech chart, but you can see they both match, right? So the numbers can be slightly different, but you see Sensitech also has food and drinks as the #1 commodity, and then home and garden, and then miscellaneous. So you see some slight differences. And again, this can be depending on who reports to Sensitech and who reports to CargoNet. You can see some variances in their numbers, but in large part, they'll show the same categories with the same breakdown, and they both do a good job breaking down the information. When we talk about food and beverage, again, we show how this is an up and down thing, right? And we see big changes, and a lot of this, again, can have to do with reporting, but we do see it as a very highly targeted commodity, and again, continuing to lead all the commodities. Now, you'll see quarters, like in this quarter, it probably wasn't the #1 stolen commodity on the list, and some other quarters you might see where it's not the #1 stolen commodity on the list. By the time the year shakes out, it still remains the #1 commodity on the list.
Scott, I need a clarification if you don't mind, and because my earlier days and some people are hearing us have been my face-to-face programs, my favorite client in the whole world was a beer distributor. That was my favorite insured forever. And I understand
I can't hold that against you. That's not a bad thing.
Well, I love that. We have access to all the free beer I needed. But anyway,
sure.
But I understand alcoholic beverages have to be distributed by a licensed entity, that part of it here. So when we talk about food and beverages, Is this including alcoholic beverages like beer and wine and those things, or other things like soft drinks and crackers and things like that? I just wondered if there's a distinction between those.
Nope, all of the above, right? So the food and beverage will include alcohol, and you can actually, we talked earlier about CargoNet, and probably now, based on this question, is a good time. So CargoNet and Sensitech, both are companies. CargoNet, you said you know them well. CargoNet is a great resource. If you don't have internal resources, or even if you do, becoming a member of CargoNet will allow you to get a breakdown in that data, as an example, right? So if you're about to haul alcoholic beverages and you want to know, okay, of that food and beverage category, how much of it is alcohol based, they're going to be able to break that out and actually show you, okay, and they usually do this in their report too, of that food and beverage category, how much of it is frozen meats, how much of it is alcohol, how much of it is dry goods, things like that, right? So you can get some great detail from them, and they can actually also, let's say you're a trucking company and you're about to take on a contract where you're going to be hauling alcohol, and you get your lane assignment, they can actually do a lane evaluation. Both of these companies can do lane evaluations and show you how much alcohol has been stolen along that lane. Is it a targeted commodity along that lane? And then you can, react appropriately for that. But yeah, the answer to your question is it does encompass all those, and then they can break it down for you.
Okay, just curious, because I know the difficulty of getting rid of that has some more difficulty than you would the typical soft drinks and things like that.
Sure. Now, and it does, the soft drinks obviously are a big target too, especially when you talk about energy drinks and things like that. Those are highly targeted parts of that category. Electronics, you see the up and down of this, and we mentioned earlier that fourth quarter bump around electronics, right? So this comes right around Christmas time. We always kind of say it doesn't feel like Christmas in the air until the first load of video games has been stolen, right? So we always, it's kind of the wake up call of the season has begun, right? So the video games are being targeted, or video game consoles, or various other things, the tablets and the laptops and things like that. But we do see a bump in that around the fourth quarter, in large part because of new releases of a lot of the electronics and the games and the phones and things like that around that time of year. So when we talk about cargo theft, we break it down into two main categories. The two categories, we call them straight theft and strategic theft. Straight theft is exactly what it sounds like, or what you'd think of, and is the most common way that cargo is stolen, which is, they steal it at the truck stops or the parking lots or the roadside parking. They physically go out and they steal the tractor and the trailer, or the trailer if it's not married to the tractor, and they physically go out and take it and disappear with it. And that's what we call straight theft. And that also includes pilferage, and we'll spend a little time talking about pilferage because that's a real big deal. And then there's what we call strategic theft. And strategic theft is when they basically trick you into giving them the cargo. And those are unconventional means, either the use of some cyber or fraudulent methods, deceptive information, identity theft, fictitious pickups, things like that. We'll talk a little bit about both of those as we go forward.
And when we do, let's talk about coverage in those areas, because that's where some gray areas are too.
Yep, we can talk a little bit about that for sure. So I mentioned pilferage, and again, this gets to the reporting thing, right? So roughly around 2014, there was a really large case. Our team worked on it with a couple of other industry entities and law enforcement that became a really big case and stretched out across multiple states across the country, and it turned out to be a pilferage theft. Now, pilferage is when they don't steal the whole load, but they steal part of the load. So they open the rear doors, they take a pallet, they take half a pallet, they take a couple of pallets, and they disappear with it, leaving the rest of the load there. Pilferage is a real problem. We've always known that pilferage is the most common type of cargo theft. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump ahead there. But after that case in 2014, again, the experts in the industry go out and they start to preach to the industry, hey, we need to report pilferage better. And as that message gets out there, you see pilferage go up. So has pilferage gone up? Yes, we have seen pilferage go up, but we've also seen reporting around pilferage increase severely as the industry becomes more and more aware of it.
Scott,
So
would this be where you have the exceptions to a receipt for your overage and shortages and damages, and this is where the shortages would show up, and the driver doesn't realize that it was shorted until they actually get to the final location, and at that point they're not so sure if it was not loaded properly or they miscounted the load? Is that why it was so hard to kind of
it
pin
can be
down?
that, yeah, it can be that. We'll actually show an example that kind of really details what you're talking about as we go forward. But some of the issues around pilferage, right, is where did the theft occur? So when we talked about reporting and the industry doing a better job reporting, if a driver leaves California and they're headed to Texas, we know, Tommy, that they're going to stop multiple times along that route, right? Now, if they don't do a walk around, this is a good process and procedure for a driver to have in place. If they don't do a walk around of their tractor and trailer every time before they leave from wherever they've stopped, then they're going to have a really hard time figuring out where did the pilferage happen. So if they get to Texas, they get there, and to your point, they get to the consignee, and the consignee says, hey, your seal's broken and the load's missing half a pallet. Now, if the driver hasn't walked around that tractor and trailer and checked their seal and checked their doors at every single stop before they leave, they don't know necessarily where that theft happened. If you've stopped 5 or 6 times along that route and you didn't do that walk around, who are you going to report this to, right? What law enforcement entity are you going to report it to when you don't really know where it happened? Right? What are the values associated with that? Well, Tommy, that a lot of times the values on a pilferage can be very low. It could be a couple of boxes, can be a half a pallet, and depending on what that commodity is, that could be a very low value. That could fall below a deductible. It could be considered overages, shortages, and damages, and a lot of times that doesn't get reported. So now you don't know where it happened. It's below your deductible. You consider it overages, shortages, damages, so you don't even report it to anybody. What are the commodities lost? If it's food, and it was stolen somewhere along that route from California to Texas, you're not going to bother going out to try and recover that if it's a half a pallet of peanut butter, let's say, right? Something like that.
It's gone, yeah.
It's gone, right? And then you have the FSMA regulation where people are very concerned around.
That's the Food Safety Modernization Act for you people who are not.
Food Safety Modernization Act, yep, and where people really have a concern around seal integrity. Right. And a lot of times, if that seal is broken, you're going to lose the entire load because people are going to argue that there's a potential for contamination around that load, and that load might need to be destroyed entirely. So where it's started out as a few boxes off a pallet, it could now be the loss of an entire load.
At the side of receipt.
Right.
Or delivery, excuse me, yes.
Right. Now that's still, that's a coverage issue that has to be dealt with. It's also a contractual issue. The FSMA regulation itself says a broken seal in and of itself doesn't constitute a loss or claim, things like that. So there's a lot of detail around that has to be sorted out, but it can cause those concerns.
That's another hour webinar on FMC.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, that's a different thing, but go ahead.
So here's an example of what you're talking about, Tommy, where this is a common way to bypass a seal. Now this is a container, but you can do the same thing on a trailer, right? So you have the seal, and they'll drill out the rivet, and when they drill out that rivet, they can open the door without breaking the seal. Right, and they'll actually go to great lengths. They'll mix the paint and make sure that they put the paint on there, and they'll actually rub dirt on it to make it look like it's worn and used and things like that. And the issue you have there now is you have a shortage, but you have a seal that's intact. And so quite often when it arrives at the consignee, they see that seal intact and they'll sign for it, even though they haven't gone in and counted the load or checked the load yet. And then a couple hours later or the next day when they decide to unload that container or that trailer, they open it up and there's a shortage. Well, you've already signed for it and there's no breach in the seal. So now the question becomes what you asked earlier, which is, was it lost along the route? Was it not packed correctly? Was it, packed short? What's going on, right? And there's several ways that we know that they can get into the trailers and the containers without breaking the seal, and that can create a problem.
I heard even taking the pins out and taking the back doors off for stuff, but that would take a lot of effort to do that. But
it's a lot of effort. That's something that's been going around the industry for years. And have we seen it? Yes, we've seen it. Is that common? No, it's not as common.
It's just too hard to do, but it depends on the value of the load. But what you're trying to say is to avoid the broken seal or the obviously theft, they're able to do things like that to delay the when it's found out, and then suspicious about what found out.
Yep, it gives them some getaway time, so to speak, right? Now, we mentioned earlier last mile couriers, right? We've seen an increased activity and theft in the last mile couriers over the last few years. Again, an increase in reporting and an increase in the activity, right? We mentioned earlier that for last mile couriers, they're often targeting the pharmaceuticals. There is a potential for a higher frequency of violence. So again, we said in the United States, less than 3% of all cargo theft has violence associated with it. And when we do see it, some of the times that we see it, it's around this last mile courier area because of the pharmaceuticals and the values behind the pharmaceuticals, right? So we see a little bit higher potential for violence around that last mile courier. We also see often minimal security procedures around last mile couriers, the minimal use of security devices or active tracking in the little sprinter vans or whatever it is that they're using, panel trucks. Sometimes internal involvement is suspected, that you pointed out earlier, but again, this can be largely overstated, so you have to be really careful around that. Route familiarity, right? The same courier can go to the same drop locations every day, multiple days a week, things like that, that will result in them being easy pickings for the thieves, right? They know that around 1 o'clock on Friday, the last mile courier is going to show up and do a delivery at this location or sometime around there. Driver complacency. The drivers can get very complacent because they're doing the same locations every day over and over again. We also see in areas, where it's hot in the summer, they'll leave the van running so the air conditioning's on, or in the winter, they'll leave the van running so the heat's on. And so you kind of have a perfect storm that comes together and makes last mile courier a big target. Recoveries are less impactful, and quite often when you make recoveries on there, the entire load has to be destroyed. And a lot of times independent contractors are being used to do the last mile deliveries, and there's less control over that.
That's that mini model that this last courier. And a lot of these things are not even 18-wheelers or pickup trucks, or even not even straight jobs in those areas, which also would have a less qualified driver. That would be a factor too? It could be a factor, could it not be?
Could be, yeah.
Because you didn't do the background check and you did PSP and that kind of stuff for this, because they would not have to have a CDL to drive these units.
Right. Now, we talked earlier about strategic theft, and identity theft is one of those common methods of strategic theft, and that's just like it sounds like. It's where the bad guys steal the identity of a legitimate trucking company, and they pose as that trucking company in order to go and book a load on a load board or with a broker, and they fool you into giving them the load, thinking that they're the legitimate trucking company. So if you being
the shipper is fool.
Could be the shipper or could be the freight broker.
The freight broker,
right?
Yeah, but the shipper actually on their docks, and the broker will give them an assignment. I agree. Okay, that's why when you say you, I just want to qualify what the you was.
Sure. And so a lot of times this will cause a lot of confusion, right? And who's liable for it? And this is where communication can break down, because everybody's wondering, all right, who's liable? Who let this happen? What happened? So is it the legitimate carrier? If somebody steals the identity of ABC Trucking, right? Are they liable for that? No. More than likely, their liability or their chance at liability is slight, if any, based on the responsibility for the theft of its identity. They become a victim, in other words, in most cases. Now, you've seen some arguments of if somebody knew that their identity had been compromised and was being used and they did nothing about it, can arguments be made there? That's for the attorneys in the courts to figure out. I'm not an attorney and either are you. So, but in most cases, the legitimate trucking company becomes a victim too, because their identity has been stolen. And then the intermediary liability. So when we talk about the freight broker, right, we know that one of the main ways that a freight broker can become liable is through vetting of the carrier or improper vetting of the carrier. So if the broker hires the bad guys, they could end up liable. They have potentially higher risk of liability for hiring the thief than anybody else.
And you know, this is a big question here because the conflict on the first one, obviously, directly, your shipper has our insurers have a direct relationship with the shipper. We want to satisfy that shipper, and the problem is how far are you going to go to say, shipper, it's your problem, I don't owe you anything because it's your problem. The second part of it is because I guess in Carmack, this would be excluded as shipper error or receipt error in that part, which is one of the 5 exceptions in the Carmack amendment. But that becomes a gray area, and I totally agree with you. And I've heard about this where, you know, one truck gets loaded and another one comes, well, we just loaded you, and it's a question now. How have you found your policies addressing that, or is it just all up in the air?
Well, it depends on the coverages that you're looking for. In general, the one thing you want to make sure is that you're having, you know, coverage that addresses various types of cargo crime or loss due to crime, right? And if you're hiring carriers that are legitimate, and you had mentioned this earlier, you know, what coverages do they have, right? Are they covered for crime? Are they covered for the commodities that you're asking them to haul? Things like that. So you have to do a good job vetting the carriers that you're going to hire, whether you're a shipper or a broker, and make sure they have the coverages you want. The best thing to do to avoid that type of a loss is to make sure that you're verifying that the company that you're hiring is legitimate and is really ABC Trucking and not somebody posing as ABC Trucking. And that's how you avoid this in general.
Yeah, this gets back to the shipper. We have it later, and I don't mean to get ahead, but this is also where I've talked earlier about, or have talked often in programs we've done about cyber liability could be involved in this because it's typically done over the internet. But go ahead. I'm sorry, Scott. Let's go ahead and bring that because you have that later.
How do they do that, right? They can peruse and actually try and change information on the safer by submitting a change, the MCIEF 150 form, try and change your information so that if you're trying to use that to verify, they can actually try and get that information changed so that they're the point of contact. By using your identity, they can solicit false bids, right? So they can actually pose as a broker and put a bid out there for a load. A trucking company submits their carrier packet to them. They're actually the bad guys. Now they have everything they need to impersonate that carrier. They have the carrier's carrier packet. They make some slight changes to it. They can turn around then and pose as that carrier to submit on loads. They'll generate false accord certificates and W-9s. They'll change telephone and fax numbers and cell cards on a regular basis so they're hard to track. You can't track their usage or their phones. And then open and obvious information that's readily available. In other words, if you're a trucking company and you have a website, you know, one of the things I always ask is how much information do you put on your website? Because you have to think about the fact that if you're giving too much information, it could provide enough information for somebody to, in essence, try and pose as you or steal your identity. So you have to be careful about what you're putting out on your company websites or out on the internet. Fictitious pickups, I think, and you've been alluding a little bit to this, Tommy, is where they actually show up at the point of pickup and they pose as the carrier. So in the fictitious pickup, and you'll see fictitious pickup used as a general statement, right? As, you know, we call it strategic theft, and a lot of people will use fictitious pickup as the label for that category. I stay away from that because fictitious pickup is a specific type of strategic theft. Identity theft is where they steal the identity and pose as the carrier. We just went through this, right? They pose as the carrier in order to book the load. Fictitious pickup is where you're actually booking the load with a legitimate carrier, but the bad guys show up at the point of pickup, and just for that point of pickup time, pose as that carrier. So you have a legitimate shipper or broker hiring a legitimate carrier. Everybody's involved in the deal with good intent and intending to do exactly what they're supposed to, and the bad guys find out about that load, and you know, maybe it's scheduled to be picked up by the legitimate carrier at 1 o'clock on a Friday. The bad guys show up at 11 o'clock on Friday posing as that carrier, and they take off with the load. They're given the load at the dock. They take off with the load, and the legitimate carrier shows up at 1 o'clock looking for that load, and it's gone.
And this gets back to the question about shipper error. Why didn't you do it? And the shippers are not good at it. I agree. I mean, this is the one I talked about earlier. That's kind of hard to pinpoint who could be liable in this area, or at least can we deny the claim, I guess is a better way of saying it. here and
Very
then
much.
upset the shipper.
So when we go forward, we also see double brokering scam, right? Where the bad guys, again, will pose as a trucking company. So they pose as ABC Trucking in order to get the load booked with them. They do that, they get that load booked, and then they turn around and they pretend to be a freight broker and they rebook the load. And a lot of times they'll rebook the load with a legitimate carrier. Now, I want to be very clear here that the legitimate carrier becomes a victim too, because they have no idea that they're being booked by somebody pretending to be a freight broker, right? So they think that they're just doing their normal job every day and they're bidding on a load, and they get booked for this load and they go out and they pick it up, and that bad guy who's posing as a broker gives them a different address to deliver the cargo. So they'll go out, they'll get the load, and then they take it to a location other than where it was supposed to go, so that the bad guys can then take off with the load.
Wow.
And the double brokering has been going on for a while.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Now the question becomes, why do they book a legitimate carrier? And we always talk about this when we're teaching classes or at some of the conferences. And the reason for that primarily is because they're going to pass the smell test at the point of pickup, right? They're not doing anything wrong. They don't know that they're involved in this scam and that they've been hired by a fake broker. So if they're asked to produce their ID, they're going to produce their ID. If they're asked if you can take a picture of the driver, they'll let you take a picture. You know, they don't have any worries because they're legitimate. So the bad guys will take advantage of that.
And that does get a gray area because it's not shipper error. Who's the shipper, the address and that stuff. Anyway.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
All right. This is the thing.
So over the years, and I'm just going to briefly touch on this, but over the years, especially over, I'd say since 2012 to 2013, we've seen an increase in the use of technology to commit cargo theft, whether it's the use of cyber methods to gain information through phishing emails, things like that. When we do see cyber, it can be a real problem, including ransomware that can really shut you down for a day. And Tommy, if a trucking company or a freight broker or a shipper gets shut down for a day and held ransom, that's going to be a big problem. That's a lot of volume in a day, right? 3D printers. So roughly around 2015, I think it was, in Europe. And sometimes we see that, things happen in Europe first and then come here, or they might happen in South America first and then come here. But in Europe, the reports started to come out about the use of 3D printers to duplicate seals. Now, we haven't seen a confirmed incident of duplication of seals with 3D printers here in the US, but it could be happening, and we're not doing a good enough job checking the seals when they're being cut off the trailers, or maybe it hasn't happened here yet. But it has happened in Europe. It's been reported several times over there. Jammers surfaced in the US on a more frequent basis around 2012, 2013. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation saw a lot of that. They became really good at giving instruction and educating the industry around that. But the use of jammers to jam covert tracking that's put in the trailers in order to try and recover or secure loads. And then the use of barcode scanners. We've seen the thieves, download barcode scan apps on their phones so that they can check the cargo to see what the value might be or how well they can sell it, things like that. So they're up on the technology. They're introducing the technology into their theft methods. What do we know? We know that law enforcement has limited resources and personnel to address the issue of cargo theft locally. We talked about that earlier. They're concentrated in certain areas. There's also less of them nowadays that are dedicated to cargo theft or trained in cargo theft. The task forces sometimes are cut back or disbanded or have dual responsibilities with auto theft or other things, and they're overloaded sometimes. So private industry participation and assistance is needed to combat cargo theft. If you're involved in the transportation industry, whether it's from a trucking perspective or like myself from the insurance perspective, what are you doing to help law enforcement help you, right? If you're just showing up saying, hey, we had a theft and we need you to solve it, they can be quite overloaded. They can be backlogged. And again, we go into that. If you're reporting it late, like we showed in that earlier slide, and it's, theft happened 7 days ago, things like that, you're going to have a hard time. So you need to really work with law enforcement and participate and be part of the solution.
And a lot of the people listed here are retail agents. So what I've learned from going through this, Scott, and really appreciate is to let our insureds know, particularly the smaller ones, that everything they haul can be theft prone, and they need to be cognizant of that. You mentioned verifying the seal is still there, walking around after every trip. Also,
Right.
have heard that don't just detach the tractor, because obviously a trailer standing alone will be easier to steal. If you have to detach it, maybe put a kingpin lock on or something. Can't do it. I've also heard somebody said mark the trailers in such a way, even on the top, that can be easily identified. In other words, not a white stripe, a strict trailer, but something that can identify that's that trailer. So when you turn it in, but there's things like that depending on the high volume here, but just to let the drivers be more cognizant about turning the truck off and doing the things like that, Scott. I think that's what the retail agents can take away from here, that everything's theft prone, so everybody needs to be aware of this.
Yeah, and Tommy, you make some really good points, right? So if you have the tractor married up to the trailer, you have another level of security, because if you can secure the tractor and the trailer together, right? If you put air cuff locks on the tractor, and the tractor is attached to the trailer, and then you put, let's say, landing gear locks on the trailer, now you have immobilized two aspects of that load.
And they're going to walk away from it. They're not going to steal something that's harder to steal. That's what we're talking about. There's a dissuasion.
That's exactly right. They want the easier job. They want the easier theft. You want to harden your target to the point where it just makes it miserable for them, and it's going to take too long for them to get it. Now, can they get past those things? Have we seen them get past those things? Yeah, but does it make it a lot more of an arduous task for them? Something that they may not want to take on? Yeah. When you talk about the markings on the trailer, we always comment on that when we're talking to clients or teaching seminars, when we say, asking somebody to go out and find a stolen white 53-foot dry van is like trying to look for the guy in the cowboy hat at a country music concert, right? I mean, it's, they're everywhere. So, have some markings, right? Or, one of the things we've taught clients over the years is take the last 4 or 5 digits of the VIN number of the trailer and paint it on the roof of the trailer.
Right. So
now, the thieves won't know that that's on there. The thieves won't know that it's on there, but law enforcement can sit on an overpass. If it's stolen in Memphis and believe it's headed to Miami, law enforcement at times, if we go back to instant reporting and they think it's going to move down there, there's potential for law enforcement to sit on an overpass and see that, or for, somebody in the air to see that. So there's various things that you can do, but having markings on the trailer itself that are open and obvious. The thieves like those plain white 53-foot dry vans. So if you're putting the name of your company or a big logo on the side of the trailer, it's much easier for you to tell law enforcement, hey, our trailer was stolen and here's what it looks like. And you can actually send them a picture and it's got our logo on the side of it, 10 feet tall. That's going to be easier for them to look for than a plain white 53-foot dry van.
Scott, you got your phone number here, which I would appreciate. I assume if an agent needed to talk to you, you could walk them through this, or at least give them some points for their insured without trying to sell your product. I understand that's your job too, but we get a lot of people like yourself who even though they have a product to sell, recognizes that if you help the retail agent to avoid these things, it's better for the industry. So we really appreciate you spending your time with us today to explain this to them and be available for our agents and our members of the foundation to tap into your expertise.
Absolutely. I think that's an important point, Tommy, that it's not about sales. It's about sharing information across the industry, which is why we're doing this with you this morning, right? And just in general, trying to lessen cargo theft or lessen these types of losses. So people are more than welcome.
We thank you. We thank Travelers for allowing you to have this time. We remind you that for information on all of our offerings, you can go to MCIEF.org. We've put up a lot of new webinars concerning basic coverages and all that. And we'll look forward to you to seeing us next month. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tommy. We appreciate the time.